Alright, so I've repeatedly asked some of you guys what it is that you want to learn more about, and everyone wants to learn more about abstract expressionism, so we're going to be talking about that today. Abstract expressionism was a post-World War II art movement, and it was significant in that it really recontextualized New York City as the center of the modern art movement. Formerly you had the avant-garde circle centered in Paris. Then when World War II came about, you had, the war ravaging Europe, and you had a lot of prominent European artists who were moving to America, and a lot of them moved to New York City. So that sort of became the new mecca of the modern art world. The name abstract expressionism is really sort of an umbrella term, because there were a lot of different styles from a lot of different artists who are collectively referred to as the abstract expressionists, but their styles were all very different. And really the only thing that a lot of them have in common is just that they were living in the same place, New York City, at the same time, post-World War II. And the name itself derives from Expressionism, German Expressionism, and then abstract, referring to a lot of the other abstract modernist movements that influenced the development of abstract expressionism, things like Futurism and the Bauhaus, and especially Surrealism. Surrealism was an extremely important precursor to abstract expressionism because of its emphasis on stream of consciousness painting and accessing the subconscious. And then you got this kind of new view of the paintbrush as an extension of the artist's subconscious, and the manifestation of that would be things like Jackson Pollock's action painting, which was very visceral. So as I was saying, these artists had a lot of different styles. Most of them were not explicitly expressionist or even abstract. And abstract expressionism is typically viewed as nihilistic, maybe even a bit anarchic, but I think what it's essentially about, more than any of those things, is just freedom. And this was extremely important in a post-war society, at least with post-World War II. The newest threat, of course, would have been the Soviet Union, right? And this is the age of the Cold War. And artists embodied this ideal of freedom by avoiding the traditional prescriptive forms in art. Things like perspective and naturalism, realism, in favor of this more unbridled, free expression, which is how abstract expressionism, I think, becomes so closely associated with freedom. But it's sort of paradoxical in a sense, because you have art that is meant to be about nothing, right? It doesn't imitate reality in any sense at all. This is purely art for the sake of art. It's treasured for its own aesthetic value. It has no moral or ethical claims. It doesn't attempt to imitate reality in any sense. And in that manner becomes apolitical, because it's not really about anything. It's just art. But in essence, being apolitical is a political statement. And that's the paradoxical part of it. So an instance of this embodiment of freedom in abstract expressionism is especially salient, I think, in Pollock's action painting, as an example, whereby the canvas becomes a sort of arena, and art becomes this event where each stroke of this action painting becomes a gesture of liberation. And the act of abandoning perspective, of abandoning the traditional prescribed methodology in painting and of art, is inevitably going to be a political act, and inevitably going to be this embodiment of freedom. And this was something that had never really been done explicitly before in art. And this was essential, as I said, in a society that was so caught up in the war and the terror, and some of the emotional repercussions of that were so deeply felt by many of these artists. Many, as I said, were forced to abandon their homelands in Europe and move to America. And the way they filled that void was by embracing this concept of freedom, by abandoning all the traditional, rigid, almost totalitarian ideology that had advanced art up until this point. But of course, there's a lot more to abstract expressionism than just Jackson Pollock's action paintings. I mentioned the tremendous debt that was owed to other modernist abstract art movements, especially like in the works of de Kooning. We have synthetic and analytic cubism, and also color field painting, which was this new idea of painting these large expanses of color, solid shapes of color, where the emphasis wasn't so much on the artist's gesture or his brushwork, but on creating this sort of uniformity in a piece of artwork through color. And this was something that was typically associated with Rothko and his multiform paintings, which sort of became his signature. And we can see further examples of this aesthetic technique of color field painting in the works of Hans Hofmann, Clifford Still, Barnett Newman. I particularly like Newman because his works are so recognizable. He always included these zips, are what they called them, which are just basically dividing lines of color. But if you think about it, they really segregate and concomitantly unite the painting. They separate these fields of color, but at the same time they establish this sort of harmony within the entire work. So these color field painters became really an important sect within abstract expressionism. Rothko specifically believed that these solid planes of color, which were devoid of really any trace of symbolism, of reality whatsoever, could revive mankind from his spiritual emptiness. This was an idea that was borrowed from Friedrich Nietzsche, and a lot of philosophers had a profound influence on abstract expressionism. Sartre was another major contributor, at least for many of these artists. But at the bottom, the basis of any abstract expressionist work was this idea that figurative painting, figure painting, was always going to be hopelessly devoid of feeling, because any imitation of reality which figure painting sought to obtain was always going to be hopelessly inadequate. And that's why they sought refuge in these more abstract expressionist pieces of feeling in this time of recovery from war.